everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Gwyneth Mallon. I'm the director of the NYU Center for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here this evening. I want to thank our staff, Caroline Osi, Denny Valentin, and our student assistants, Soraya Bunker and Janina Soriano, for their help with tonight's event. We are pleased to partner with the Contemporary Literature Series this evening and with the Colloquium on Postcolonial Race and Diaspora Studies, both in the Department of English, and we all collaborated together on tonight's event. Tonight we're going to enjoy a reading and discussion of John Keene's acclaimed work, Counternarratives, which is just out in paperback, and we actually have it for sale for you in the lobby after the event, along with annotations, his earlier work. This collection of stories and novellas draws upon memories, newspaper accounts, detective stories, and interrogation transcripts to create new and strange perspectives on our past and on our present. The stories range from the 17th century to the present day, and they span multiple continents. This collection has been called suspenseful, thought-provoking, mystical, and haunting. I'm really looking forward, as I'm sure we all are, to hearing from John Keene this evening and all of the panelists. I'm going to very briefly introduce Nicholas Boggs, who's going to moderate the evening. He'll also introduce the panelists, and then I'll turn the evening over to him. We'll make sure to save time for Q&A with all of you. Nicholas Boggs is Clinical Assistant Professor of English at New York University. His scholarship has appeared in the Cambridge Companion to James Baldwin, Callaloo, and James Baldwin Now. He is co-editor of a new edition of James Baldwin's little-known child's story for adults, Little Man, A Story of Childhood, which is forthcoming from Duke University Press. He is the faculty coordinator of the English Department's Contemporary Literature Series, which he launched in 2012. And without further ado, I will turn the evening over to Nick. Thank you.
I'd, of course, like to thank Gwyneth Mallon and also Catherine Osi for all their support for this event. It's the third time CLS, the Contemporary Literature Series, has collaborated with the Humanities, Center for Humanities, and every time it's a packed house. So thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank our Director of Undergraduate Studies, Ginny Kim Watson, for her support of CLS and our students' interest in contemporary literature. But most of all, I'd like to thank our Undergraduate Contemporary Literature Series student fellows themselves. I'll ask them to stand in just a minute. But these are the undergraduate students who helped run this series, which brings noted authors to the NYU campus and into our classrooms all year long. You may have met some of these students passing out our cards, but please feel free to talk to them at the reception afterwards. Some of them are wearing sweatshirts with the series on them. For now, if you guys could just stand for a second, those of you. So these are our student fellows. Thank you, guys. It's their one moment of recognition all year long for the work they do. So, okay. In a moment, I'll introduce our esteemed reader and panelists, but first a note on timing. As Gwyneth said, there'll be a reading followed by a conversation, a Q&A, and then a reception and book signing afterwards. So we'll hope you join us for that. So first, our panelists. Sonya Posmentier is an assistant professor in the Department of English and a scholar of Black diasporic literature and culture, 20th century poetry, and environmental writing. Her first book, which I've had the pleasure of reading, Cultivation and Catastrophe, The Lyric Ecology of Modern Black Literature, is forthcoming from Johns Hopkins University Press. The book argues that extreme environmental experiences such as hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes, as well as the slower social disaster of enforced agricultural labor, have shaped Black modern literature and culture. Her critical writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, American Literature, and the edited collections Race in Real Estate and The Blackwell Companion to the Harlem Renaissance. Phil Harper is a literary scholar and cultural critic concerned primarily with 20th century American fiction and with aspects of lived experience in the contemporary United States, including the negotiation of racial, gender, and sexual identities and various modes of mass cultural production, circulation, and consumption. His books include Framing the Margins, The Social Logic of Postmodern Culture, Are We Not Men, Masculine Anxiety, and the Problem of African American Identity, Private Affairs, Critical Ventures in the Culture of Social Relations, all of which I've read, and also his most recent book, which I also read, and was celebrated here at the Center for Humanities not so long ago. It's Abstractionist Aesthetics, Artistic Form and Social Critique in African American Culture. This came out in 2015. It champions instances of African American artistic production that assert their essentially artificial character rather than striving for realist verisimilitude. It contends that such aesthetic extractionism shows up the constructedness of the racial political circumstances amid which the artwork emerges, thereby subjecting them to critical scrutiny and making them amenable to transformation. And last but not least, our visiting author tonight, John Keene, poet, fiction writer, essayist, critic, and translator, a longtime member of the Darkroom Writers Collective of Cambridge and Boston, a graduate fellow of Cave Canem, who we've partnered with for CLS actually, and a board member of the African Poetry book series. He is chair of African American and African Studies and teaches in African American and African Studies and English, as well as the MFA program at Rutgers-Newark. He's the author of the novel Annotations from New Directions in 1995, poetry collection Seismosis, a collaboration with artist Christopher Stackhouse, the short fiction collection, of course, Counternarratives, which received a 2016 American Book Award, a 2016 Lannan Literary Award, and was one of 2 finalists for the 2016 William Saroyan International Prize for Fiction Writing. The art book Grind, an art text collaboration with photographer Nicholas Muehlner, and the poetry chapbook Playland. Counternarratives also, just last week, won a Fitzcarraldo Prize for New Directions Press. As we will the prize rewards, quote, bold, brave, and brilliant small presses. As we'll hear more about from our panelists, Counternarratives is certainly all of those things, bold, brave, and brilliant. It's also destined to feature on course syllabi for years to come, as it has this academic year in the English department on both the undergraduate and graduate level to great effect. It's my great pleasure to introduce John Keene.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, very good. I'm going to try not to. We're supposed to be very close to these, but when I get too close to the microphone, all kinds of sound starts to come out. So I want to begin by thanking Sonya Posmentier and Phil Harper, who were incredibly kind in and patient in arranging this visit, and I had the opportunity to meet with some of their graduate students earlier, and that was just a really wonderful experience. Thanks also Nicholas and Catherine Ossie and Gwyneth and everyone at the New York Center for the Humanities Contemporary Literary Series for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor to be here. And strangely enough, I should say, when I was a graduate student at NYU, in the late 90s, I did a reading, and then I had not had any contact other than walking through the campus and et cetera for years. And then this is the 3rd time in the last few years when I've had the opportunity to come here. So it's always an amazing experience to come back to one of my alma maters. Okay, I'm going to read a section from a story that I never really read from. In part because it is the longest piece in the book. It's actually a novella, and the formal title is Gloss on a History of Roman Catholics in the Early American Republic, 1790 to 1825, or The Strange History of Our Lady of the Sorrows. And I just always think of it as Our Lady of the Sorrows, but whenever people are writing about the book, they have to try to figure out how to truncate that. So we'll go with Our Lady of the Sorrows. I'll say, just as a setup, that it starts in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution and then moves to Kentucky in 1804, right? For 1804, 1806. So shortly between that, in that period, a period of a few years between the Haitian Revolution and sort of the beginning of the early American Republic. And the speaker here is a young woman named Carmel. And all you need to know really is that Carmel was enslaved in Haiti, and then she ends up in the United States in this convent in Kentucky. And up to this point, Carmel really has not spoken at all, and we don't know why she doesn't speak. We don't know if she's mute. There are rumors that someone has cut out her tongue. There are rumors also that she has been subjected to a spell, etc. So this is Carmel's voice, and I'm just going to read a portion of the sort of the latter part of the story. Have I ever had a vision of hell, that place to which this faith, in whose intimate and suffocating grasp I have passed the last few years of my life, and to which Eugenie, and this is her mistress, from our very first days together in Saint-Domingue, had constantly threatened the Heavenly Father would consign me? I have not. Or rather, I have, but yet never have I devoted more than the bare minimum of my interest to it. I know the hell of the Gospels and Le Catechisme, the sermons of Father Malevaux and the other priests, the tuition and exams of Sisters Charles, Thérèse, and Ambrosienne. I have pictured it. Perhaps I've even drawn versions of it. And the other thing is she has this gift of drawing almost, she goes into kind of a spell herself and draws elaborate tableau. Okay. Where was I? Okay. And I maybe have even drawn versions of it, though it has never meant anything more than the illustration of an exercise, a foreign mote of knowledge to me. Have I, however, lived a form of hell, lived in one, or perhaps several? Most certainly, and perhaps am in one now. Of course, there are hells and there are hells, which is really a statement of banalities. But there are degrees of horror, of horrors, which we all witness and live through, sometimes directly, often indirectly, and it is the immediacy of horror, its sublimity, and our incapacity even to reflect upon it, though we may indelibly remember it, that shapes our sense of what a particular hell, or hell itself, may be. The word had begun to foam like spittle on Eugenie's lips every time she eyed me, though she did not dare utter it or cast a single aspersion in my direction. Instead, as the weeks crept forward through the infernal heat, she crept with the utmost care around me, taking care not to offend me even in the slightest, as if she could tell, though I would not have deigned to tell her, that the departure of Du Juste and Aida, whose superintendents had finally been fetched home by their parents, opened a hole in my affections. We had not grown as close as I liked, but we nevertheless passed increasingly amounts of time in each other's company. Du Juste's bright humor and wit clarifying as we sat and packed crates of pamphlets, Aida's skill at producing seemingly insignificant signs that needed only the right person to decode them, providing me with an intellectual and spiritual workout of the kind I had not encountered before. I woke one morning after a troubled sleep with a severe headache, a novelty for me, and when I reached the refectory, I saw that there were 2 fewer white girls at the table, and I knew instantly that early that morning, Josephine and Mary Margaret, with Du Juste and Aida in tow, had gone. That left only Marionnette, whose temper was still occasionally a challenge, as a companion, though we seldom found ourselves together for long. As we passed in the hallways, we would share thoughts, ideas, dreams. She longed first of being manumitted and going to live in Washington, where she had relatives and where she had been born, though she had been sold off when the first estate to which she had belonged had been divided at the death of its owner. Phaedra, it turned out, was not her sister by blood, and though they had been raised together as if they were, she had never heard of Haiti. She also did not know much French beyond what she had picked up during her short stay, and no Creole or Latin at all. I tried my best in the slots of time allotted to us to rectify that. Her temper, she realized, was like the wick of a lamp too often turned to its brightest setting, and though she had cause, as we all did, she was learning, striving to lower it. We tried to arrange a time in which I might show her my drawings, but Annie Laurie, who like Eugenie had been left in the nun's care, was now demanding as much of her time, if not more so, as Eugenie had previously required of me. One night following a day so hot it appeared to have scorched much of the foliage to a brown fur, I woke to hear Eugenie creeping past my bed. The room was as black as the moment before a nightmare. She no longer bothered to force me to pack her sheets in her absence. Everyone in the convent was usually so drained by the heat that they slept as if drugged. I turned over on my side away from her and tried to go back to my dream, in which Phaedra and I were slowly walking across the river. But I could hear the white girl fumbling through my papers, so I sat up as quietly as possible. What was she looking for? She tossed several things into a cloth sack, replaced the stone floor, and bustled out of the room. When I was sure she was halfway down the hall, I trailed her. She advanced through the darkness more quickly than I would have imagined, but I could still make her out. She was, I knew, going to meet with Father Malevaux, perhaps to show him my handiwork, though to what purpose I could not foretell. Perhaps she now bore his child, and she was planning yet again to run away, this time with him. Let her go with him. I would not try to stop her. I had plans of my own. I was curious, however, about why she had taken my art. She made her way not to the first floors near rear portico, where I had seen them before, but continued upstairs to the attic, moving almost soundlessly and without a single stumble, which made me realize that she probably had practiced and traced this route multiple times. At the end of the hall, however, I could hear a din, almost imperceptible, but enough to gain my attention, coming from the direction of the town. I pulled back one of the velvet curtains to see what was going on. There were tiny pinpricks of light flaring from Gethsemane, which is a nearby town, but intermittently. Nothing, at least from this distance, was clear. Pulling myself from the window, I went to the attic staircase and moved as swiftly as I could, cat-like, my ears pricked, my eyes cutting through the murk. Voices, or at least one, issued from the main room there. The door was cracked, and I slid through. To my left, Eugenie was telling her lover that she had all her garments, some coins, sturdy boots, her cape, and the maps, mine, the one I had drawn, which she had studied assiduously and was sure would serve them as well as any others. Her lover did not speak, but I wondered, given how frequently Father Malivo had come and gone from west to east and back, why he would need to depend on one of my maps, drawn in any case from my inner vision and not cartographic accuracy. He persisted in not speaking, and it struck me that he might be communicating with her in another way. Papers rustled in the darkness until I could tell he was stilling her, calming her. She asked if the horses were ready, and he conveyed to her that they were. I stepped out of the way to let them head downstairs. I was not going to betray her to the nuns, since I was sure she and her popish paramour would not get far, at least based on the maps I had drawn, and that they would find that out soon enough. Right near the door, she turned, her shoulder-slung sack swinging and nearly hitting me in the face, and asked, "How long do you think it'll be before they discover you took all the money?" I was not surprised at this bald statement of duplicity and sin, and yet I was. Father Malivo, whatever he was or was not, had never seemed to me to be an evil man, let alone a thief. Even the Haitians at and around Val-d'Oreille had recognized this, French and ever liberal with Christian casuistry, though he was. The voice that responded to her in a hard, somewhat stammering twang in English was not Father Malivo's, however, but another's. Just like I told you, just like you told me, I put enough of it in their food, they ought not figure I'm gone till midday. It was Job White who spoke. I must admit that his presence jarred me, at least momentarily, and I was determined to find out what was going on. I commanded the lamps to come on, and they beamed with an unearthly light. Eugenie and White, ready with sacks at their sides for flight, both suppressed their urge to cry out, but did back away from me immediately. "What are you doing up here, you black witch?" she said to me, her voice breaking just above a whisper. I was going to answer, but I could hear the hubbub from outside growing louder and closer. With a clarity I have never felt before or since, I could see the crowns of the torches gathering in the town square before they made their way up the hill. I could see them as I looked at Eugenie and White, who were both so pale as to appear ill. Despite this, Eugenie repeated her question and then said, "We are leaving, and you cannot stop us. I've placed all of your demonic writings, your hellish instructions, that diary full of gibberish and nonsense in a flour sack just inside Sister Louis-Marie's door. We also left a letter for Job's father, Reverend White, and for others in the town to let him know that the nuns were harboring you, and you won't be able to say a word in your defense. Rather than wondering where I've gotten off to, where we are, I silenced her and exited the room. The door I made sure I sealed shut. Almost as soon as she began pulling on the knob, as he began heaving his shoulder into the wood, their screams started. Downstairs, there was a shuffling of feet and startled wailing. I got to work. The wall outside the room leading down a story was an expanse of paint. The wall outside the room leading down a story was an expanse of paint the hue of buttermilk. But I now knew I no longer needed it, nor the charcoal I kept in my pocket. Instead, as I walked down the stairs, I urged Marionnette, Rochelle, Hubert, and Moore, all asleep in their quarters out back, to go immediately to the stables and ready horses and carts, which they did, each dressing as quickly as possible, each baffled for a moment that they had had the same aim until they realized its source. I thought about letting the nuns counter the reverend and the townspeople on their own, but it was not, it seemed to me, the charitable thing to do. And although they had assisted in the maintenance of my bondage, that would endure as a cross for their conscience to bear. I roused each of them from their prayers, their default response in the face of an approaching threat, as if they had lost all command of reason, and set them to motion. The only white girl other than Eugenie, whose screams now echoing throughout the upstairs and building had turned into something almost animal remaining, Annie Lowry, had also never been a source of torment. So I hoisted her as if she were a marionette from the corner of her bedroom into which she had barricaded herself and spurred her to aid Marinette, in the process muting her so she could not give a single order. Not one of the nuns, not the Mother Superior, not even Sister Francoise Agnès, in whom I had some semblance of confidence, had thought to ring a warning bell, so I had her do so. At another window that looked out onto the town below, I could see the flames at the base of the hill ascending like a wave of gold toward the convent. Lamp and candlelight from the room seared through the dark. It was as if I were painting and in the painting at the same time, as if the inside and outside were fusing into one rich polysensory perspective, and I almost had to stop for a second to steady myself. The nuns amongst whom I passed, though not a single one spotted me, were grabbing crucifixes from the walls, stuffing books and papers into bags, and reciting snatches of scripture in French. Their rosaries they did not think to look for, thankfully, since they would not have found them. I had already collected and disassembled them over the last week so as to have the necessary tools at my disposal. I continued forward, forcing Annie Lowry, weeping uncontrollably, down the main stairwell where she had stalled and outside to the stables where Hubert and Marinette had hitched several carts, into which Rochelle had packed enough bread, water, and dried food to keep everyone fed for at least a day or two. When I reached the Mother Superior's room, the sack containing all my handiwork was not where Eugenie had claimed, but sitting beneath a desk. Whether she had put it there or the Mother Superior had moved it was unclear, but no matter. It was heavier than I thought it would be, but once I rifled through it, I was sure that save for the maps, everything I had accomplished since arriving here filled it. I hefted it over my shoulder and started to leave the room when, glancing back, I saw Father Maliveau sitting on the edge of the bed, immobile as if stricken. I thought to leave him there, especially as in the blue of his irises and the sunburnt contours of his face, I could read the pilasters and eaves of Valderay, the crop of Nicolas de Lecard, the fusillade of Napoleon, and Louverture rotting in a forgotten cell, but I thought better of it and stirred him such that he barreled past me, wearing only his dressing gown. There was nothing in my own room that I needed to take with me beyond the pitcher of water and the washing bowl that sat beside Eugenie's bed. I made my way back to the attic, stopping briefly to peer first into the backgrounds where I could see everyone seated on horses or piled into the carts, which began to take off toward the river's oxbow, Moore's knowledge of the area enough to save them, and then out front where a contingent of the townspeople, their faces lit white with torchlights, were belling around in a semicircle on the front drive, chanting for the nuns to open the door and show their faces and to bring Job White Jr., Eugenie, and me out. I thought to turn them all into a giant, writhing pyre, but that time I knew would come. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I will turn things over to Sonya.
I'm so glad that you read that story. I was actually wondering if you ever read from it. It's my favorite in the book. So, and particularly the section with the maps that will possibly lead in the wrong direction or the right direction. I'll begin a little bit formally in a way that I hope will then just open into a conversation. Because one of the things that I really love most about the book is sort of the expansiveness of the geography that it offers us for thinking about Black history and culture. And maybe because in our graduate seminar, which John visited earlier today, we've been talking about it in the context of Gilroy's The Black Atlantic and Christina Sharp's In the Wake. The part of the geography that I feel particularly drawn to is the aquatic or the marine. And so I'm especially thinking about one of the epigraphs to part 2 of the book from the Bajan poet Kamal Brathwaite, Knowledge is Submarine. So I wanted to start by sort of meditating on that a little bit. And while that invitation opens the second section of the book, in Counternarratives, the whole book begins on the water as the first protagonist comes ashore this island, Mannahatta, in a canoe. He'd been born across the sea in a ship, and he'd worked on ships in Santo Domingo to buy his own freedom from enslavement. Counternarratives then comes out of the water and onto land, but quickly takes us back into the exploratory territories of rivers. And in Our Lady of Sorrows, which I'd been calling Gloss, so I'm glad now to know what to call it, the 2 girls that we heard about, Eugenie, the daughter of a plantation owner, and Carmel, her prophetic enslaved handmaid, escaped the revolution in Haiti by traveling to another plantation in the southern US. But I've never been over the water, one says to the other. This is an earlier section of the novella. Where am I supposed to go, and what am I to do when I get there? So the status of Carmel's freedom in the convent in the southern US becomes one of the questions at stake in crossing the water. Later in the book, the Mississippi River flows through the inverted story of Huck and Jim, and the submarine is realized as the bottom of a cold northern river in which the songwriter Bob Cole finds his end. So what strikes me about the epigraph from Brathwaite is not only that it points to a sort of underwater knowledge, a knowledge other than or against dominant epistemologies, but that the water connects these apparently local, even extremely isolated watersheds through the networks of the Atlantic. It's as if the movement of the book has been to take us from the edge of the water to its underneath, where we, like the book's characters, might either drown or survive through these submarine connections, which I guess is maybe one of the biggest questions of the book for me in any case. So there's a much more oft-cited quotation from Brathwaite's essay, Caribbean Man in Space and Time, which he begins with a sort of poetic fragment. The unity is submarine, breathing air. The problem is how to study the fragments whole. So I really wanted to begin by asking about what it means to evoke Brathwaite in this way for you in this book, and I guess more broadly to address the relationship between geography and knowledge and the idea of a whole in the book, or unity in the book that is in many ways made out of these sort of local fragments. So any part of that you want to start with?
That was wonderful. Wait, is on? Okay. Oh, there we go. So that was a wonderful introduction. So I mean, I don't, I don't know what. There's so much I could say. So just to sort of pick up the thread of Brathwaite and this idea of knowledge being submarine. I mean, he has a remarkable trilogy. I think it's Mother Poem, which I read when I was a student of his, Sun Poem, and Ex-Self. And one of the things I always remember about his discussion of Mother Poem was this idea of those hidden rivers and byways, those hidden possibilities of connection, right? That connect the fragments that may not, or these spaces that may not seem to be connected on the surface. So that, in a sense, the book, each of the stories is a kind of rhizome in a way, but there are these connections, sort of lines of, in certain cases, filiation, in other cases, affiliation, that connect the stories, that allow us to sort of expand our understanding of each individual story, but of course of this larger and rich and complex history that often we get in very sort of reduced or kind of caricatured form. I also love that you mentioned the connection with both Paul Gilroy. The Black Atlantic was an incredibly important book for me, and really an inspiration in a way that many works of fiction and poetry and drama have been for this book. It was one of those scholarly books that I read. It was like, like I was reading a comic book. It was like, it was deeply complex, but with a sense of thrill. And I felt the same way about Christina Sharp's very recent book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. I think it's a really remarkable book, and I urge everyone to check out that book. But both of those books, Christina's book, of course, I read after finishing this, and Paul's I read before. But there's a way in which the sort of expansiveness, but also the way they kind of cut against the grain and thinking about, the vast and sometimes seemingly unconnected spaces of the Atlantic, of the Black Atlantic, right, of the Triangle Trade, and of course of the Middle Passage, that sort of speak directly to what I'm doing. And I see my work, I see this book, and my work in general as in conversation with them, as with people like Kamal Brathwaite. And as I mentioned to the students earlier today, tomorrow, if you're free, please go see, and you speak Spanish, or even if you don't speak Spanish, you just want to see him, please go see Edgardo Rodriguez Julia, who's going to be here at NYU, visiting from Puerto Rico. He's one of my favorite authors, and he's also mentioned in here, and he's really sort of another extraordinary figure who's been a huge influence.
Sonya and I were talking. I don't know. I can't tell whether this is on or not.
Right.
It is on?
Right.
Okay, so I just have to be, wow, you have to kiss the microphone here. Okay. Sonya and I talked beforehand about how we should divvy up our tasks, and she suggested that my primary task would be to gush. Because she knows that I have been gushing about John Keene for years and years and years. So I'm really happy to take that opportunity. I'm not sure exactly from which direction to gush first. But I think given what Sonya and John have said, I'll actually start from a place that I didn't anticipate starting from. And it has to do with, John, the way in which you engage history in this book. Particularly in this book. I don't think it's unique to this book, but it seems to me to be more intensive here. It's obvious to anybody who's read the book that you take history very seriously. And this is something that I've thought about to some extent. I actually gave a scholarly paper on this very question with respect to one of the pieces in the book, an outtake from the ideological origins of the American Revolution. I would be shy about repeating what I said in that talk, except only 3 people heard it. So I think one of them's in the room, but hey, sorry, Sybil. Given the starting point for that story, or given the title of it, I don't know that the title is actually the starting point. One can't help, upon reading it, feeling compelled to go back and look at the ideological origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn, which I did in preparation for that paper. And one of the things, having read this story, made me realize about the writing in that work of history is, and it's something we all have been taught for many years now, about the literariness of historiography. But having read an outtake made me understand better exactly the sorts of literary strategies that Bailyn pursues in that work. In particular, he uses free and direct discourse in a way that's really, really interesting. Somewhat sinister, you might say, with respect to the subjects that he's actually engaging, really compelling. And that made me think about the ways in which you, I wouldn't say on the contrary, I would say in sort of complementarity, you use free and direct discourse in that particular work, but you also use, and this is not unique to that piece in the book, you also use a mode of, seemingly objective, godlike third-person narration that when you couple it with the more subjective way of proceeding that you have in free and direct discourse, suddenly becomes unsettled. And of course, it helps us to unsettle what we see in someone like Bailyn. So that's a long roundabout way of inviting you to say a little bit to all of us about what you have in mind when you're engaging historical narrative or history in general, and what it is you believe that fiction can do in conjunction with historical writing that historical writing might not be able to do on its own. That might allow me to get to some of the other ways of gushing that I want to approach. But that might be a good place to start.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for actually giving a paper on that story. That's actually another one of my favorite stories. And interestingly enough, in almost all the reviews, they sort of skip past that story. And I don't know whether it's because it entails slavery in New England, which is not ever supposed to be discussed, or slavery in the North, or Zion is just such a superstar that people can't really deal with him. But I would just want to say that I'm very happy that you actually and of course you're a scholar, you're a brilliant scholar, so you would do this, look up the title, because people have said, it's just such a pretentious title, and I think we've got Google now. I mean, just Google that title, and it'll pop up. Bernard Bailyn, he won the Pulitzer Prize for that book. It was first of his 2 Pulitzer Prizes, right? One way of getting at this that I was sort of talking about with my students. I'm teaching a course right now on history and myth and contemporary African diasporic fiction, and one of the people that we read this very short little, beautiful little essay by Natalie Zeman Davis. And in this essay, I think she's the author of The Return of Martin Guerre, that famous, a number of other books, and a really major historian. And one of the things that she talks about is, let me see if I can state this correctly. Historians want to know the facts, right? They want to be faithful to the archive. They don't want to over extrapolate. They want to be able to present a historical account that is factual, right? That's sort of based on what's actually there. But one of the things that we all feel about the past is we want to know not just what the facts are, but what was it like to live at that time? What was it like to move through the world? What was it like to see through the eyes of people like us and unlike us? And so I feel like fiction provides a lens for how to do that, or one way, or sort of it serves as a kind of tool, and I mean in a very positive way, not just in a sort of instrumental way, for us to sort of enter the lives, the stories of people of the past. Now, one other thing I'm going to say is, so there's various kinds of historical writing, and when I was in my 20s, I used to work at MIT. I had this sort of peon job, and I would work at MIT, and I would go to the MIT bookstore, and you're like, where the hell is this going, right? And I had a friend who worked there, and as young people in their 20s do, he was working there. He was totally bored by everything in there, and I was like totally fascinated by every book that the MIT press published, because they published all these humanities books that were really unusual compared to everyone else. And so I would say, hey, Victor, can I possibly, get a discount? And so we had this deal where, I would get a discount, and anyway, so I ended up with a lot of MIT press books. Okay. I was just like everything. So it was like almost like a third or fourth education. And I came across the journal October, and they had a special issue on the writer Alexander Kluge, who's very important to me.
I have that issue.
You have that? I love that, right? And the scholar Andres Huijsen wrote this piece, I'll always remember it, called Analytical Fiction. And I was like, what on earth is analytical fiction? And he was talking about the sort of work that Kluge does, right? Whereby he's writing about the past, but there's a kind of critical component woven into that fiction. And that was something, I think I must have read that essay like, I don't know, 100 times, and read, of course, there were 2 stories by Kluge then, and this was before there were translations of Kluge. And now I think New Directions has done several of Kluge's books, and Seagull Press has done a few more, and I think the editor-in-chief and president of New Directions mentioned to me that I think they've got a Kluge book coming like in a few years. So anyway, so please read Alexander Kluge and go see his films and read his scholarly writings too, because he's brilliant. But that idea of sort of analytical fiction was really important to me. And so when I was writing this book, I realized, particularly with a story like An Outtake or another story called On Brazil, there might be a way of looking at the past, thinking through the past, with all of the components of fiction. So with pacing and drama and rich characterization, etc., that also had this critical aspect. And so I think that's sort of how I think about this work in relation to history. And one last thing I'll say is I was very concerned because I'm on the floor at Rutgers-Newark with historians, right? So AFAM is right next to the history department. And so, and my dean is a historian. And so I was really concerned about what the historians would say. And everywhere I go and I give a reading, I'm always worried, oh my God, the historians are going to be like, what the hell is that book? But in general, they have been very, very positive and sort of praised how the book sort of thinks through and plays with and negotiates history.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Should I continue? Do you want? Oh, okay. Okay, so now I'll gush from the direction that I was planning to gush in to begin with. I have two additional big questions, and maybe I'll just get them on the table. So first, the real gushing. And it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of meta-gushing, because I'm gushing about the ways in which I've been gushing for 20 years now about your writing, because I've been telling people about it for that long and saying, John Keene is the best writer ever, and so on and so forth. And then often, if they're not familiar with work, they ask me, to characterize it or to characterize you as an author. And most frequently, I have found myself in those instances saying, well, I don't really know what to say, except that he's really a writer's writer. And then, of course, the minute I say that, because there's nothing more cliche, really. So the minute I say it, it sounds really hollow and empty and stupid to me, and which forces me to wonder, okay, what do I mean when I say that? And upon wondering, I'm led to realize that, okay, when I say that, when I say, John Keene is a writer's writer, what I really mean, I finally figured out, is that your work constitutes a really profound reckoning with language in all of its intricacy and complexity and beauty and mystery and all of those kind of, ineffable things that sound too embarrassing to talk about in 2017, but at the same time are, for a lot of us, what first got us interested in literature to begin with. And then, of course, when I say that, I realize, well, actually, though, it might therefore be a mischaracterization to say that you're a writer's writer, because not all writers are actually interested in that sort of project,
right.
Truth to tell. Or they're not engaged in it, or they haven't even thought about it necessarily. But that definitely seems to me to be something that's at the core of what you do. And given also something else you said in our graduate seminar earlier today, because as Sonya said, John has said he was nice enough to visit our graduate seminar earlier today. Something you said there really struck me and stuck with me. It's related to the earlier point about history too. And I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but it was something like that you understand yourself to be working to redirect or divert the normal course of history and of language. Something like that, right? I'm gesturing to people in our class. Yeah. I'm sorry? The river of language, that's what it was. Thank you. To divert the river of language. And as I recall, you characterized both history and language with that river metaphor and indicated that you understood yourself to be working to divert both of them. And I thought that was a really fantastic way of kind of getting at what I have long felt about your use of language. So I'm interested in whether you could talk about that. And then maybe as a corollary to it, though I'm not sure it's a corollary to it, but it's still an interesting question. I would be really interested in your talking as well about your relationship to the novel as a genre, as a form. Because it seems to me that you've always been writing around the novel. Mm-hmm. That's true of annotations. I think it's true of counter-narratives even, and it's certainly the case that, even in the publicity for this event, we actually mischaracterized Counternarratives as a novel in print,
That's
like
fine.
on that poster. We've done it in our class. It's that mischaracterization is cropped up. And there are ways in which it's verging on the novelistic, even though neither this work nor Annotations is a novel by any stretch of the imagination. And I know that you're working on a novel now, but it seems to me that you've kind of arrived there in a relatively oblique way that might give you a really interesting perspective on what the novel itself does, or what it can do, what it does that's different than what you're doing here, or what these things are doing that are different than a novel per se. So on the one hand, language; on the other hand, this big generic entity,
Okay.
loose and baggy monster.
No, those are great questions, and so let's take the novel first. So one of the quotations in one of the things I always say to students is, I'm one of these people. I teach creative writing among other things, and it's sort of strange that I wrote an 80-page novel and a 250-something page book of short stories. It's usually should be the reverse. But one of the quotations in Annotations, one of the citations I have is by the writer Clarence Major, who was another major influence, and he says something along the lines of, anything is possible in the novel. Life is another matter, right? And I've always really sort of been fascinated by, because I came of age, at the moment where realism is I'd say the 60s, 70s, 80s. I was born in the 60s, but 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. Realism of a certain kind was very big, and but also there were all those amazing metafictional writers, right? That were sort of in the major metafictional and experimental writers who were kind of in the mainstream. Some of them were really highly regarded white writers, and then of course it was also the heyday of Black women's writing, which was incredibly important to me. I mean, I think about reading Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, and particularly those two, and feeling so empowered to just to sort of think about the novel as many possible things. I mean, especially like reading, starting out with a book like Bluest Eye, which to me did not look like the novels I was seeing, in school that we had to read. Like what did we have to read? Well, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Lord of the Flies, and what else? A Separate Piece.
A Separate Piece.
Do you guys know these books, right? Let's say that other than Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there were no Black people or people of color in any of these books, but they were also sort of fairly straightforward. And I think, but then there was also, on my own I would be reading things, and of course in my home there were, my mother had a wonderful little library of books. I mean, she had all of Baldwin's books, and I remembered a few years ago when I was at the James Baldwin conference, having read James Baldwin's Just Above My Head when I was maybe, 12 years old or something. And I'm thinking, no kid should be reading this book. This is it's a brilliant book, right? But it's there, But on another, so just feeling this sort of a sense of possibility. And then, at every stage of my education, as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, when I was with the Darkroom, just sort of coming across writers who were really pushing against the grain. I mean, a writer like John Edgar Wideman was so important to me when I was young. In terms of just the way he was playing with sentences. So I'd say that, I think it's okay to call, with Annotations, I say it's okay to call it whatever you want to call it. It could be a memoir, it could be a book of poetry, it could be a novel. I think of it as a novel, and the publisher called it a novel, so I was like, I'm fine with that. And with this book, there are novellas in here, and short stories, but some of the reviews overseas actually have spoken of this as a novel. They call it as a novel. And I think there's a way of thinking about it in an associative sense, as I was saying earlier, of having a sweep and a continuity in a certain sense, and a scope that is novelistic. Okay, so I'll say that to language. before I ever wrote a word of fiction, probably I was writing poetry, like many writers, and poetry is incredibly important to me. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got from a teacher when I was a student here. I studied with E.L. Doctorow, another just a huge influence and an amazing person, and he said to our entire fiction class, "You should always be reading the poets. You should always go to the poets and sort of get into the body of language, right? See what it is the poets are doing, because every fiction writer can learn something from them." And that's something I try to do all the time, is to read poetry. I mean, I still write poetry, but to read poetry, to think about language and think about it with care and think about what it can do, and not to just assume that, because there are certain conventions out there, that these are the things we have to follow. The quote you mentioned, and I'll sort of stop after this. The quote that you mentioned actually is by another writer who's a contemporary writer who actually lives in the United States. He's Franco-Congolese, and his name is Alain Mabonkou. And I've actually translated some of his poetry, but he is one of the major fiction writers in the French language, and he's actually now up for, I saw, the Man Booker International Prize. I think this is the second time he's been up for this prize. So I highly recommend go read Alain Mabonkou. Go read Broken Glass. Go read African Psycho. I mean, his work is somewhat disturbing, but he's a brilliant writer. But he made this statement that I think gets to the heart of what I'm trying to do, and I think what a lot of writers of color have always been doing, which is think of it in the African American tradition, the Black diasporic tradition, right? You think about all these multiple traditions. To see that, I mean, the English language is, is something that we were sort of told we couldn't speak, we couldn't write, right? We were forbidden to read and write it, and to sort of take it and to assume that it is this medium that we should not play with, to me, is deeply problematic. So he said about the French language, right, which is like English, an imperial language and a colonial language. I want to divert the river of language, and that's something I think that I really take to heart, right? And with me, it's not just language, right, but also form, right, and genre. All of these things to kind of push it as far as it'll go.
Thank you for that, and I wanted to ask if you could say a little more about I guess your relationship to translation in that process. It's thematized in the book. In various ways, but it's also part of your practice. So,
well, translation has been it's been really sort of a wonderful experience for me in a lot of ways. It strangely, or maybe not strangely, it actually, when you translate, not only does it allow you or force you, it forces you and allows you, it opens a door into other cultures, right? Other social, political, cultural economies, but it also makes you think about your own language. So when I was translating the writer Hilde Ilst, who was a really extraordinary Brazilian novelist, she was deeply controversial, and she wrote poetry, she wrote fiction, she wrote plays, and so I actually translated I think it was second of a tetralogy of books. 3 of them are fiction, 2 novels, 1 book of short stories, and 1 a book of poems, and they were what she called porno chic, and she is great, right? She, she was so brilliant, and she really wanted readers, and so she thought, how can I have readers? This was part of her thinking, and I don't think I'm mischaracterizing it, but she's like, I want readers. How can I have readers? And so one of the things she realized is, of course, people will read, almost anyone will read pornography, right? So she weaves in these really sort of obscene elements into each of these 4 books in various ways. And the book Letters from a Seducer that I translated I think it's a sublime work. But as I was translating it, I would go through and it would really make me think very carefully about English. Why do we say things the way that we do, right? How do why do we put words together the way we do? Why does saying one thing one way mean one thing and saying something another way mean another thing, right? And why is there, for instance, many cases with Ilst, why were there no real I had to come up with approximations, no real direct translations of what she was doing or saying, right? So anyway, so I guess translation is another way of another kind of schooling for me. But as I said, it also I feel like it's opened innumerable doors and continues to. And I try to do it, and I try to do it as well as possible. But sometimes it's a huge challenge, but it's a fruitful one.
It makes me think a little bit of that essay by Baldwin, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, where he talks about having to going to France and developing a different relationship to English through being away from it.
Yeah.
Time for one more, I think, at least.
Oh, one more.
Well, let me just say, I'm glad you mentioned Shakespeare because I teach Shakespeare to one of the intro classes, and I always have students who are like, oh, God, I have to read Shakespeare. And I had a friend many years ago who was like, John, you go on and on about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's not that great. Okay, it's just not that great. And I was like, what are you talking about? But every time I walk through one of Shakespeare's works, and the last few times we've read Othello together with these mostly freshmen and sophomores who want to be English majors, I'm sort of struck anew at how extraordinary, that language, that really sort of entering into a mode of being is. And I find I learn something all the time. So yeah, read Shakespeare among your many options.
Well, if we do have time for time for one more? I'll ask one more question that sort of opens out, takes us in a direction we haven't really pursued yet. And it's about how you now, or how you have in the past, understood the function of your work in terms of installing you in a community. I'm thinking in particular of your long-term association with the dark room. That's one type of community. It's not the only type of community to which you or anybody else belongs, but it is a kind of model for a certain type of collective writerly project. And I'm wondering to what extent you feel that your experience there continues to shape what you do. How did it shape it when you were highly active in the dark room? What do you think the kind of collective undertaking that's represented by the dark room or other such configurations can mean for writers as contrasted with people who are working, in a profoundly solitary way, the way some people do?
Well, it was a really extraordinary experience. I say this all the time. It was like, it was an education of a kind that you can't predict or foresee, but was as valuable as any other education I ever received. And part of it was because it was non-institutional, right? We were a group of young writers who came together in Boston, in Cambridge, which was at that time a fairly hostile place. Boston has that reputation. But I mean, on one level, hostile, racially hostile, and on another level, really sort of open. It was really fascinating to think about the duality of Boston at that time, and probably even today, though I think the last few times I've been there, it seems like it's much more laid back.
You can walk to South Boston now.
Right, exactly. I was once chased there on St. Patrick's Day.
Exactly.
Chased from the station, by some townies. So, but with these writers, I mean, I think we didn't set any limits on what was possible. So one of the things we did, we had no sense of, so I just graduated from college. I was an undergraduate, and in my last semester in college, I studied with Ishmael Reed, who's another extraordinary person. I mean, just on so many levels. And he did amazing things. Like he would say, go see everyone who comes to read, no matter whether you like their work or not. You just go see everyone who comes to read, and take notes and listen to them. And if you can afford to, get their books. If not, right. And he actually brought the writer Meme Bersenberger to Harvard, and so I got to meet her. And that was really sort of foundational. But then after that, when the darkroom started, I think most of us had no sense of, okay, well, if a writer comes to town, you got to pay them money. But most of these writers, I will say, were willing to come, and they would say things like, okay, I'll sell my books and, buy me dinner or feed me or let's do something. We can hang out and I don't know, And some of them were young at the time, like Elizabeth Alexander and Paul Beatty, Cornelius Eady, Randall Keane. Some of them were very famous, like Alice Walker, Derek Walcott, who just passed away. I mean, they would come for almost nothing, and read their work and share their work. The other thing about the darkroom was, since it was not institutional, everyone from the community would come. So I remember I learned about it in the barbershop. I remember people would come, and when Ntozake Shange read, people were all up and down the stairs, outside the windows. So the kind of, the sort of, again, the space of possibility that it opened up was tremendous. And I think we've lost some of that nowadays, because I think people feel like they have to be in institutions, they have to be in programs, they have to have degrees, they have to be legitimated by certain presses, et cetera, and maybe are a little afraid or unwilling, or maybe not. I mean, I understand it, but to just kind of take those leaps, right, and to create these kind of communities. But I would say that, also, too, we were reading everything. We were listening to all kinds of music. There were artists who would come in. There were people who were drummers, dancers, people who were DJs. So anybody who wanted could show up at the darkroom. And the other thing, too, was, most of us were black, but it was blackness in the broadest sense, right? So some of those, there were, two of the writers were Haitian American, there were Latino writers. I remember, I think when Derek Walcott read the first time, he read with Martinez Espada, right? So it was just real. And then of course the other thing too is, and I say this because from my perspective, although some of the members may have different perspectives, but I felt like they were very open in terms of people's sexuality. So I remember, one of the people that I got the opportunity to see through the dark room was Samuel Delaney. Another one was Essex Hemphill before he died. And there was no like, oh my God, we can't have gay people in here. We can't queer people in here. It was sort of like, okay, these are great writers, so let's bring them in. And again, all these people agreed, amazingly, they agreed to come for almost nothing, right? So on a lot of levels, I think it sort of always gave me a kind of grounding that you don't need an institution to do what it is you're doing, right? But you do need a community. Community is very important, and it's not just one community, but multiple communities. And the thing that we should always be trying to do as writers, as artists, is to sort of create these communities, right? And not think that they have to be mutually exclusive too, right? You can be part of this one and this one and this one and this one. And I say this to the younger writers and younger artists, younger scholars, right? Create these communities, right? Because of course, they're going to be what sustain you for the long run.
Thank you so much. And in that spirit, maybe we'll open up to some questions, yeah?
Hello. One of your short stories in Counternarratives features a character from Huckleberry Finn, Jim. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to kind of reinterpret that character.
That's a great question. Well, one of the things I've said before when I've been asked this question is that it was very painful when I was a child in school reading that book and being the only black person in my class and having some white classmates, gleeful that they could use the N-word, right? And of course, they would say it a certain number of times, and then the teacher would say, "Stop it," okay, And of course, then there were some of the my other white classmates whose just faces were just like, "Oh God," they felt bad, right? But no one was saying, "Don't say that," because of course it's in the book, right? And so I hated that book. And I would see over and over and again, this is the most amazing American novel. It's just great. It's just Twain's novel about America and Huckleberry Finn and blah, blah, blah. And people were like, Huck, it's just so great. I'm like, okay, so, you know. And then at college, I read the book again. And I think I was older, and I developed a certain amount of appreciation for it. And I said, no, this is really an important book. But it was still painful. But I also wondered, why doesn't, has anyone written about Jim? Has anyone told Jim's story? I'm really interested in Jim, right? I mean, who is this person? And then I realized at a certain point, Jim probably was living the life of my great-great-grandparents who lived in Missouri, right? Some of them. So then I read the novel again, and then the last time I read it, I thought, okay, maybe I'll try to tell Jim's story. And as always, I was saying to the class earlier, I'm always convinced that 1,000 people have done what I think I want to do. So I was like, I know there's going to be tons of Jim novels. I mean, I know if I go through, and I think I usually will, like one of the catalogs I'll usually go through is NYU's or Harvard's, right? The New York Public Library, to just see like the most comprehensive catalogs I can find. And I couldn't find anything, any sort of novels or short stories about Jim, although they might exist. So I said, okay, I can't write a novel about Jim right now, but I'm going to write a short story. And then I also wanted to imagine Jim not at the time of Huckleberry Finn, but later. Because, of course, right after that story takes place, you have the Civil War. And someone of Jim's age, I mean, there were people black people in their 40s, men, 40s and women, but 40s and 50s who participated in various ways in the war. So I wanted to get him in the war, and then I also, just one tiny last little thing, since one of the stories, The Aeronauts, takes place at the beginning of the war, I wanted to write a story that took place at the very end of the war in Texas, right? The last battle of the war is in Texas. It actually was in Texas, and the Union lost, but the Union already won. So it was kind of like, an unnecessary battle. But anyway, so all these things sort of factored in, and then I said, okay, I got to tell this story. So that was sort of the starting point. And when I finished, I thought, I've actually, I feel like I've been true to who Jim might be, who he might have been, who he might have become, right? But I've sort of given him a life beyond the life that Twain gave him. And also Huck, and I'll say, Tom. And one of the other things that people always say is, why is Tom so bad? Why is he so evil? And I always say, go back and read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Tom is really not a good person.
Someone in the back.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about objects, particularly in Our Lady of Sorrows, but it's also, there's a few other kind of emblematic objects like the little stick, construction in the first story, and also the rosary beads in the part that you read, that detail of Carmel having already disassembled the rosary beads because she needed them, but I don't know if I just missed it, but you never find out why or what part of, I can't remember if they were key, if they return, and I guess there's probably more examples, but I was thinking along the lines of whether you had in mind something about, there's something sort of fairy tale about some of those slightly enchanted seeming objects that recur.
That's a great question. So I think in a number of religious traditions, right, and spiritual traditions, right, objects play a key role. And with the rosary beads, I think I was thinking of Carmel making a veve on the floor as a way of summoning her powers, because I don't want to give away the end of the story, but there's something she's been trying to do the entire story, among other things, that she's finally able to do at the very end of the story. But I think part of it was to try to get as much of the material culture or sort of materiality of each world in the story through these concrete details, these concrete objects that are true to the story, but then also many of them do have a kind of symbolic, a mythic, a spiritual resonance. So that's why, for example, even that first story, it's both a kind of visual guide, but also it has a kind of mythic resonance, symbolic resonance.
Hi, so we briefly talked about like the role of history in Eugenia Storia, and I was just wondering, so Hayden White is a historian and he offers a critique of the traditional view of history, that it's more of a narrative or illustrative fable that's dictated by the speaker in national, regional, or ethnic terms, and you brought up the idea about how we want to know what it was like to live during those times more than just the facts, which would lend to the idea of it being more of a narrative. And with that idea that history is something that is kind of determined more by what's omitted or silenced, and I was wondering, how does that shape the retelling of certain histories, especially of Black people, especially in terms of how our history was kind of erased in a lot of ways for those who were slaves, and I was just wondering how you kind of navigated that in your story.
Well, that's again, that's a great question, and I would say, one of the things that I love what you said about, the importance of narrative. I mean, every day. So we organize ourselves as humans in part through narrative. Narrative is absolutely crucial, and I say this all the time to students, to friends who are writers, et cetera. I mean, I think I'm so much more aware of this, and one of the things I'm also sort of aware of is how narrative and our emotions relate, right? I mean, and the power of narrative to shape emotions. I mean, there's okay. So thousands of years ago, some very smart people sort of figured this out, right? That you can, if you read, Plato's Republic or, Aristotle's Poetics, right? And Nicomachean Ethics, et cetera, right? They're talking about how powerful language, and not just language, right? But stories, certain sorts of genres and forms, how powerful they are in shaping our sense of the world, but also our emotional beings, right? Where am I going with this, right? Well, so I say all this to say that the narrative is key. And so in terms of sort of rethinking history, both in a kind of larger sense and a specific sense, I mean, one of the things that Sonya said earlier, I think really sort of struck me. I'm aware of it always, but I think she put it so beautifully. And one of the students actually also, or maybe it was one of the students who said this, right? That this idea of architecture and how, that's right, you did say this, architecture and the characters, how the characters are sort of part of the architecture, but as the stories progress, they reset it, they reframe it. So in many ways, I mean, I think the stories engage in a process of reframing, transforming those histories that are often thought of as objective, and to get us to kind of see them from different perspectives, different angles. The other thing I'll just say is you made another really interesting point, which was that the history of our past, and particularly in terms of slavery, is buried. But I mean, I would even argue that it's actually fairly. I mean, what happened last week gets buried, right, and it gets erased. So that. But we live with this, we live with these stories. We live with, the trauma, the aftermath, right? We live in the wake, right, of all of these things that are always happening. I mean, I just think about, it was beautiful how so many people called attention to, and Black Lives Matter was, was sort of one of the main groups, but there were many groups that called attention to the number of people who are killed by police, right? This was just the thing about like last year, the year before that, okay? And it struck me, if you start to read U.S. history, one of the things you see again and again and again is that often when you have what were called riots, black riots or black uprisings, it's because someone has been killed by a state authority. I mean, this happens again and again and again. And I remember I was preparing a few years ago to teach a class on it was an Intro to African American Studies, and I was looking at some material from, I think it was the 80s, and there's the riots in Miami, and of course, what provoked those riots, the uprisings, were the killing of a black man who was on a motorcycle, and you get this again and again and again. But so often, of course, when we are sort of shown or told these stories about what's happening now, that is erased. So it's not even just, it's definitely slavery. Then I have students who say to me, "Oh, professor, I had no idea. No one has ever told me what happened," and their parents have been really wonderful, right? But they said, "No one has ever told me what happened between slavery and the civil rights movement." Right, what happened then? And I talk about Jim Crow, and they're like, "Oh, I've kind of heard of that," But you think about like all of this, all of this history, all of these stories that get elided, so that we can, sort of arrive at a place where you have people say, and as I was saying to the class earlier, "Gee, this is not us as America, We don't do this kind of thing." And I always want to say, yes, we do. Yes, we've kind of perfected it, people, So maybe we can say something along the lines of, as Americans, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore, right? We want to be a better country, right? All of us, right? But let's stop saying this is un-American. Because, we've set quite a standard in our short history, so.
Time for one more.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about your relationship to the discourse of reading, and things like the role of the reader, and the reader as the writer, and in some cases where the author doesn't exist, actually.
Okay, so it sounds like you just read Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, which is fascinating. I think it's a very important essay. I do think that we always, when we talk about writers, when we talk about writing, when we talk about anything that happens in the world, we have to, at a certain level, think about the kind of larger discourses in which that, work is produced, we live, we function, we move, right? So I do think, the reader plays a key role, right? And this book probably could not have been produced. I might not have written this book 20 years earlier, or a book like this might not have been produced 20 years earlier or 100 years earlier, et cetera. So I think, this kind of larger context is key. But I also feel like, the readers always find things that at a certain level are intuitive or might not be fully conscious in the work, and I love that. I love when someone brings up something to me. One of the things that I sort of thought about, there's a sort of play on Will Smith in one of the stories, and I wondered if anyone would get it. And actually, every so often I'll get because I'm on Twitter, people will send a little, Twitter note to me saying, I got that little reference, But there are other things sort of woven in here, some of which I had not realized, right? So I feel like the reader plays a key role, and I write because there are people who are going to read this. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we give a round of applause, on behalf of the student fellows, I'd like to present John with a series sweatshirt. Please join us at the reception and book signing. Thanks for coming.